Good afternoon. Welcome back to our final session today, after lunch, of the Conference on International Monetary Cooperation, Lessons from the Plaza Accord after 30 years, which we're proud to host with CG here at the Peterson Institute. Our final panel today is going to be looking at the active debates today in the world of exchange rate and monetary cooperation. Obviously, Larry Summers' remarks to start off the conference, as well as our distinguished prior panel, were fully cognizant of the current events and talked about those. But we have a very distinguished group and drawing on some of the papers that we published in the new book that Fred and Russell edited to give you some insights into how we think things are moving forward. I would like to call upon my colleague Domenico Lombardi of CG to chair this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So earlier this morning I was saying that it would be important to reach some understanding, maybe even a consensus on two main factors regarding the feasibility of a new plaza. I was referring to the global political and economic landscape that would be conducive to a new plaza, if at all, and also the technology of how this new plaza could be implemented, referring to the scope, to the players, and to the timing. Just to put some further issues to the panelists, I would like just to briefly summarize what are some critical elements that have emerged in the discussion so far, and that I hope the panelists will be addressing in their remarks. I think one element that came up in the discussion was leadership, namely U.S. leadership. And clearly in the 80s, the U.S. was the indiscussed leader. I would say that today the U.S. is still the leader. However, the world has grown, has become much more multifaceted, multipolar, and of course this poses additional challenges. Related to that, there is a fundamental asymmetry. At the time when the Plaza took place, the U.S. was able to mobilize the G5, that is the main, the most important players at the time. Now we have the G20, but clearly, as it has emerged in the context of the discussion so far, only a small subset of those countries are really relevant to a possible new plaza. Finally, the role of the IMF, the G20, the very fact that you have institutions or platforms aiming at international cooperation does not lead to or mean necessarily that that cooperation is going to take place. And therefore, what kind of gimmick would be feasible, bearing in mind that organizations like the IMF and the G20 do provide for significant political capital and legitimacy, which I think are a key requirement in today's much more complex world. The final element, I think, was also evident in today's discussion, the role of personalities. I think Fred and Russell were referring to Secretary Baker. And therefore, what is the role of these personalities who are willing to take risks and are willing to leverage on their political capital to make unprecedented initiatives to happen? So to discuss about this and further issues, we have a wonderful panel. Fred Bergsten, of course, is the co-editor of the book, together with Russell Green, the founding director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Joe Gagnon, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and a former Fed economist, Harold James, a colleague of mine at the Center for International Governance Innovation and a professor at Princeton University, and Fabrizio Saccomanni, former senior deputy governor of the Bank of Italy, former finance minister of Italy, and currently distinguished visiting fellow here at the Institute. And he was actually among those who took Plaza, took place, sorry, was among those who actually took part in the Plaza and Louvre agreement when he had the key responsibilities at the Bank of Italy. So I would invite the panelists to come to the podium, and I would invite them to confine their remarks to no more than 10 minutes, so that this is going to leave time for us to have a Q&A and wrap up the conference. Thank you very much.
Well, the topic for this afternoon is it time for a Plaza 2? Might also view this as a test of something Larry Summers said this morning. He noted, you will recall, that we were not remotely near the time for a Plaza 2. To preview my conclusion, I agree, it's not time for a Plaza 2, but I'm not sure it's too remote, as he suggested, so I'll have a modified conclusion with respect to Larry's assertion. We can recall from the morning discussion what motivated the Plaza Agreement in 1985. A huge increase in the dollar exchange rate, leading to substantial currency misalignments, a big increase for that time in current account imbalances among the world's most important economies, and all that in turn producing a very sharp protectionist outbreak in the Congress, threatening the global trading system, especially with respect to Japan. So I think the first question is how those three variables might apply today. So let's take a look. On the exchange rates, we note that in 1980 to 85, the dollar virtually doubled in value and became hugely overvalued by anybody's concept. We had another sizable rise in the dollar from 1995 to 2002. Not as big, did not lead to a Plaza agreement, but also led to some big imbalances. Today, we now have had, over the last 5 years, a substantial rise in the dollar exchange rate, not yet to the Plaza degree, but about in line with the second largest dollar appreciation of the post-war period, and particularly rapidly over the last 3 years. In fact, Larry, in one of his recent statements, pointed out that the dollar has only risen as rapidly as in the past 18 months, twice during the past 40 years, and those are the other two periods. So point one is the rise in the dollar, while clearly not yet to Plaza levels, is getting into that ballpark, and therefore at least raises a question of whether misalignments are starting to arise. The second variable is the current account imbalances. The imbalances that produced the Plaza agreement were gargantuan for that time, but only got up into the range of 3 to 3.5% of GDP. In the more recent period, they spiked to much higher levels back in the middle part of the last decade, dropped then around the time of the Great Recession, but now have risen again. And I'm taking the liberty of using the projections of my colleague Bill Klein out to 2020, where he gets the U.S. current account deficit back up, getting into the 4.5% to 5% range. Again, not as big as we had 10 years ago, but, interestingly, considerably larger than we had at the time of the Plaza agreement. So again, you might say the data are a bit mixed, looks somewhat worrisome, if not quite as bad as it was 10 years ago. Then comes the third question. Has all this led to trade protection of anything like the intensity that produced, really, the motivating driver for the Plaza Accord back in 1985? I note in my chapter in the book that one of the critical lessons from Plaza period, at least to me, is that external imbalances of a country can become unsustainable not for international financial reasons, but for domestic political reasons. And that's an important analytical point, because practically the entire literature in international economics is all about unsustainability of deficits because of a lack of financing. The U.S. has had no lack of financing. There was no lack of financing for the U.S. imbalance at the time of the Plaza. What became unsustainable was the domestic political situation as manifest through trade policy. And so that variable has to be looked at in a substantial way. Now, last year, during the intense congressional debate over trade promotion authority, there was indeed a huge debate about currency. But interestingly, and I emphasize this in my chapter, it was not about the macro forces, the differences in monetary policies, the differences in growth rates that are the drivers of today's current account imbalances and particularly dollar appreciation. It was all about currency manipulation. It was all about the cheating by China and others, violating their IMF obligations not to competitively devalue by keeping their currencies from appreciating and building up, earlier in the decade, huge surpluses. The Congress, understandably, I think, saw those currency manipulation practices as an unfair trade practice, legitimately to be dealt with in the context of trade policy. And so in their deliberations about exchange rates, which were front and center in the debate last year, the question was not macro imbalances a la Plaza, but rather manipulation. And so that configuration continued all the way through. The legislation and changes in policy that resulted from that debate all had to do with manipulation. There have been changes in policy. The Treasury was induced, shall we say, incentivized to go out and create a side agreement to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the declaration, the joint declaration on macroeconomic policy by the TPP countries, setting up a consultative group on currency, and more importantly, the passage by Congress of the Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act in February, the so-called Customs Bill, which provides significant new instructions to the Treasury for implementing currency policy. Mark Sobel doesn't have to do this now the way he did before, but if he did, he'd be under some stronger strictures, I think, from the governing legislation. Now, the protectionist issue has, of course, now come back even more noteworthily, in the political campaigns. As I say, in the congressional debate, it was primarily not about new protection. They weren't talking about increasing barriers. They were talking about trying to counter currency manipulation as an unfair trade practice. Now in the political campaigns, particularly with Trump, we find explicit calls for new trade protection, no other way to call it. So a key question for our topic today, what is the degree of causality between that sizable run-up in the dollar, the likely continued increase in U.S. current account deficits, and the political pressure that has been generated in the political campaigns to go in the direction of protectionist trade policies? Again, I don't think any of that's going to eventuate. I don't think Donald Trump's going to be our president. Even if he were, the law doesn't permit him to do a lot of the things that he says he would do. But the pressures have clearly arisen. And so I would submit, again, that we're moving into dangerous territory, not yet enough certainly to motivate a new Plaza agreement or anything like it, but at least raising questions that point us to worry about moving too far in that direction and therefore a possible need for remedial policies. So the bottom line from all this, at least in analytical terms, and that's what I want to focus on, is what degree of currency misalignments may we now be experiencing? And there, I turn to the work of my colleague Bill Klein, who produces fundamental equilibrium exchange rates for the major currencies every 6 months, and then I make some modifications of my own. So what I'm showing you here in this chart is 3 different ways to assess the presence or lack thereof of currency misalignments at the present. And I'm using Bill's data, his models, and his parameters, but I'm changing a couple of the major assumptions. Bill himself as most of you know who follow our fear analysis, permits countries to run current account surpluses and deficits of 3% of GDP. And only if they look like getting outside that range does he deem their currencies to be misaligned. On that basis, and that's what I call the Klein Range, he's got the dollar modestly overvalued, 8%, the euro and the yen modestly undervalued, and China essentially in equilibrium. However, a lot of people think Bill is a little too easygoing in permitting countries to run surpluses and deficits of 3% of GDP. In fact, the IMF staff thinks that's too easy. So the IMF staff has come up with norms for current account imbalances, suggesting that the U.S. ought to limit its external deficits to about 1.6% of GDP. The euro, they give a surplus of 2.2, but they suggest that both Japan and China should run current account balances, zero positions. And so what I've redone is redone Bill's analysis to see what the implications for currency appropriateness would be with the IMF norms as your current account targets. And then just for good measure, I've suggested, well, maybe instead of only China and Japan going to zero, what if we thought the U.S. ought to run current account balances? A lot of people would argue conceptually U.S. should run current account surpluses. Rich countries should have capital exports, should run surpluses. Without going that far, say, what would happen if we aim for a zero balance for the U.S., and let's say that for the euro as well. So then you get these other outcomes that I am depicting on this chart. And there you get some different outcomes. What you get, just focusing then on those second and third columns, is that the dollar is overvalued by something like 20 to 25%. The euro is undervalued 5 to 15, China a little around 10, and Japan, interestingly, a little over 20%. Now, those are misalignments in terms of trade-weighted exchange rates, what we call fundamental equilibrium rates, fears. But those are trade-weighted average exchange rates. But what Bill's analysis shows is that the dollar is basically overvalued against virtually all currencies. That's like the Plaza period. So that would mean if you were shooting to eliminate the misalignments, all those other currencies, although they would not go up much against each other, would go up a lot against the dollar. And so in that last set of three columns, what I've shown is how much other currencies would have to go up against the dollar to achieve the outcomes in terms of trade-weighted averages over here on the left-hand side of the panel. There you get some whopping imbalances. The euro would have to go up between 20 and 40%, and I show the numbers, taking it up to 1.30, 1.50. The RMB, far from depreciating, which we all worry about now, would have to appreciate somewhere in the 30 to 35% range, and the yen would have to appreciate in the 40 to 50% range. Now, again, I stress, this is all based on normative judgment. You can make your own judgment as to what the right current account targets are, but if you follow either the IMF staff or certainly a zero norm, you'd find that the misalignments are pretty big. What is significant is that those misalignments, under those admittedly controversial concepts, are not all that far away from the Plaza. Remember that at the Plaza, after the Plaza, the dollar went down by about 30%. And here the suggestion is, well, maybe it's overvalued now by 20 to 25. The DM and yen both appreciated by about 50%. Now, on this suggestion, the euro's undervalued something like 20 to 40, and the yen is undervalued somewhere in the same range as it was demonstrably, or at least arguably, as a result of what happened after the Plaza. So on this kind of analysis, you might say we're in the same ballpark of misalignments, impending imbalances, potential protectionist responses that we were at the time of the Plaza Agreement. Now, I hasten to say, there are very strong arguments against trying to do a Plaza Agreement right now. mainly that the U.S. economy, of course, is doing considerably better than Europe or Japan, that the U.S. is in the position of tightening monetary policy, others are still loosening. And so, as Barry Eichengreen puts it in his paper in the book, the notion of a Plaza agreement now would be inconsistent with the underlying economic fundamentals. And that's, I'm sure, what Larry had in mind in suggesting that we were not remotely near that kind of situation. I'm merely suggesting that it's not so remote, although I concur there's not a case for a Plaza now. In addition, though I worry a lot about the protectionist rhetoric in the presidential campaign, and I worry considerably about the retreat from open trade policies that we saw in the Congress last year and in the ongoing debate in the Congress about TPP, whose passage is very uncertain, one has to admit. I would not say that the protectionist pressure is anything like at the point now that it was in 1985, when bills, including import surcharges, had already passed the House of Representatives. I mean, the famous Rostenkowski-Gephardt-Benson bill passed the House of Representatives, calling for significant across-the-board U.S. import surcharges, and that's the kind of thing that the Plaza was aiming to head off. We're certainly not at that point now. So the bottom line, I would suggest, is that there is no case for trying to go to a Plaza agreement right now, but all the variables that motivated Plaza are at least raising yellow warning signs that we have to be pretty closely monitoring and watching to make sure that we do not get to that evil point. Some of you had the great pleasure, I'm sure, to hear my Niarchos lecture here at the Institute 3 years ago. And I suggested at that time that unless we found constructive, positive ways to avoid a buildup of renewed imbalances, we might face a rerun of the Nixon-Connolly shocks of 1971, when the Secretary, people here too young to remember, when the Nixon administration applied an across-the-board import surcharge, took the dollar off gold, and Secretary Connolly famously said, "My view is that the foreigners are out to screw us. Our job is to screw them first." And he tried to do that as best he could. I warned in my remarks at that time 3 years ago that unless we found constructive and positive ways to avoid a recurrence of these problems, we might face the recrudescence of John Connolly. And folks, we haven't. Donald Trump is John Connolly squared, if not cubed. And so, fortunately, not anticipating a Trump presidency, but taking into account that that's become a serious part of the U.S. political debate, it seems to have attracted tens of millions of supporters in the primary period, I would simply reiterate my warning that if the variables I talk about go too far, we better do something constructive about them, perhaps a la Plaza. Final point. Some observers believe that the latest meeting of G20 finance ministers in Shanghai did in fact produce what I'll lightly call Plaza Light. Very light. Call it micro Plaza if you want. But there is speculation, and this is some extent David Smick's conspiracy theories, but there is some buzz that the finance ministers and central bank governors in their last meeting did at least implicitly come out with a kind of coordinated set of policies that at least try to reduce the imbalances and the problems we have today. Now, their goal number one was clearly to reduce the risk of a sharp decline of the RMB, since that could unsettle the whole world economy. But a second goal would be to limit a further rise of the dollar and avoid further overvaluation of the dollar and the consequences that that causes. And then goal number three, derivative from the others, of course, to strengthen the expansion of the world economy. So, subsequent to that time, the Fed did decide not to raise interest rates, as had previously been signaled. The ECB and Bank of Japan have both talked about reducing their reliance on further cuts in interest rates in favor of QE on the grounds that that would have less disequilibrium effect on exchange rates. China has adopted at least a bit more fiscal stimulus. The other G20 countries said they would consider that, and the Germans have done a little. China has indicated it will continue intervening to limit the depreciation of the RMB, opposite to the manipulation of several years ago, trying now to keep the RMB from declining. And the whole G20 agreed for the first time to consult closely on any future exchange rate interventions. Now, that's nothing like a Plaza, but it does portend in certain specific directions that might be heading in the direction of similar types of policy coordination, might suggest moving in that direction. It is interesting, since China's such a centerpiece of this whole discussion now, it is interesting to note that China has been behaving for the last year or two something like there would have been a Plaza agreement. The Chinese have been intervening extensively to keep the RMB from declining, i.e., keep the dollar from rising further, stop the imbalances from getting worse, and that is a kind of indicator that at least some modicum of cooperation, whether or not a full-blown G2, is underway. The Chinese might even welcome some help from other countries in intervening to keep the exchange rates from getting further out of line. So, my answer to the question of this afternoon's panel is simple. No, it is not time yet for a Plaza agreement, a Plaza 2. However, all the underlying variables that caused Plaza in 1985 are flashing at least amber warning lights. There may be some beginning steps in the direction of trying to avoid those problems becoming worse. We all have to stay closely tuned to it, and I look forward to what my colleagues on the panel have to say about the topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present the chapter I wrote in the book, and it's a little backward-looking, but it's also both backward and forward-looking. In a nutshell, the question I want to ask is, does intervention, foreign exchange intervention, matter? And if so, what should we do about it? And I should start by prefacing, after this morning's talk, this is sterilized intervention, really, because these countries, for the most part, are using their interest rate policies to deliver stable inflation. And so when you think of that's the environment with which we're going in, then intervention is sterilized. Starting in the 80s and all the way up to present, economists have been skeptical. I think it's still fair to say most economists are skeptical that sterilized intervention has big effects. But really it wasn't until after the year 2000 that intervention really became significant and sustained enough for you statistically to be able to identify these effects. And that's, I argue, what's changed. In fact, looking at the imbalances in the mid-2000s to as recently as 2013, I find that foreign exchange intervention is by far the biggest factor behind the imbalances. And therefore, because it does matter so much, then it seems to me, and it's a cross-country policy, that we do need rules. So to briefly recap the state of the literature, there's a lot of research done on foreign exchange interventions' effects on exchange rates, and disagreement about whether they had any effect at all, but even those who argue they did have an effect said it was temporary. The big problem, though, with all this research is partly, A, there wasn't a lot of intervention to look at. The amounts were small. But the other part is that we just don't have good models of exchange rates. The exchange rate is notoriously difficult to predict. It's notoriously volatile. And therefore, it's really hard to prove how it would have moved differently if you hadn't had the intervention. So the sort of insight that drove my research starting a few years ago is that maybe we should look directly between intervention and current accounts. That's what we care about. They're both measured in dollars, so there's commensurate sort of units. And also we have better understandings of current accounts, at least somewhat, and ability to model them, so we can have a better sense of what would have happened. And my work, starting a few years ago, finds large and persistent effects of intervention on current accounts. Now, recently, in the past 2 years, some researchers have come up with very clever ideas as to how to get at the what-if question in exchange rates. And including my colleague here, Olivier Blanchard, but others at the IMF, they find that using these new ideas they do find that intervention has large and persistent effects on exchange rates. And interestingly, if you then take their results and apply standard trade elasticities to those effects, you get effects implied on the current account that are very much in the ballpark, indeed perhaps larger than I'm getting. So the one thing I would start with is just for terminology. It seems to me that intervention is a bit narrowly defined. And what really matters here, this is about portfolios. It's about what governments are doing to portfolios. It's about what governments are doing to borrow or lend in foreign currencies. And so I want to talk about net official flows. Now, net official flows, the biggest component is foreign exchange intervention. Sometimes I'll use that as shorthand. But another big component, and where we can get the data, it's not always available, but where we can get the data is sovereign wealth fund purchases of foreign assets, which also are government purchases of foreign currency. And then just for logical consistency, if you, instead of lending to foreigners in foreign currency, you borrow from them in foreign currency, that should have the opposite effect, and that's minus official external borrowing. That's a small part of the story, but it actually works too. So basically, this graph shows what happened to the imbalances over the past 35 years. What you have on the dashed line is the combined current account surplus of all countries with a surplus. So it's the surplus half of the imbalances. And it's scaled by world GDP. And that's the dashed line in this chart. Now, the solid line in the chart is what their governments are doing, what they're lending abroad on net in foreign currencies. And what you see in the 80s and 90s is not too much. The spike at around 87 is the then massive Japanese intervention after the Louvre, around the time of the Louvre Accord, which was, I remember I was just starting my job at the Fed at the time. I remember thinking this is a huge amount of intervention. Well, it's been dwarfed by things that have happened since then. And interestingly, it seems to me, there does seem to be a strong case that, in fact, the large increase in intervention here is driving a large increase in global imbalances. Now, I didn't have the data complete for 2014 and I guess 14 probably would now be available, but and 2015 is still not, but they seem to be coming down. Okay, so the book has some statistical analysis, and I don't have time here to go into that. I just would like to give a shout out to co-authors on a different paper that I worked on, which I take a table in this chapter in this book based on work I did with my co-authors, Tam Bayumi, who is a colleague here now visiting at the Peterson Institute and was at the IMF when we wrote the paper, Christian Saborowski, also at the IMF, Horacio Saprissa, and Juan Miguel Londoño at the Fed, all worked with me on a paper that is on the IMF website now for the conference last November. I took a regression there, and you can just read about it in the book. One of the key issues is getting at causality. Causality works in both ways. What you want to do is you want to try to look at estimates that focus on the causality running from intervention to the trade balance. And so effectively what we do is we drop China and countries like China from the regression so we can focus on other countries where they're not responding to current accounts. But I don't have, I'm not going to go through that. We don't have time. Let me instead say a different aspect of the paper, which is let's look at a few case studies just to get a sense of the intuition here. The first case study is Norway. What we have in Norway is a very freely floating economy. There was almost no foreign exchange intervention during this time. They didn't have any foreign exchange rate target. They had a monetary policy was directly targeted at price stability in Norway and no intervention. they they had, of course, large oil exports. That's the dotted line on top. Then in the current account is a solid line below that. In the early 90s, they set up a sovereign wealth fund, and they started making purchases in 1996. That's the dashed line. And that sovereign wealth fund basically equals the entire net official flows of Norway because they weren't intervening and they weren't borrowing. So what you find is that the current account basically follows the official flows of the sovereign wealth fund pretty well. Now, there's some correlation, obviously, with oil exports because oil exports are the source of much of the sovereign wealth fund outflow. But as you can see, there's actually a widening gap between the oil exports and the sovereign wealth fund flows at the end of the sample. And the current account goes down with the sovereign wealth fund flows not staying up with the oil exports. And this is true across oil exporters. What you find is that whether an oil exporter has a current account surplus or not depends entirely on what the government does with the oil revenues. If it saves them by buying foreign currencies, it will have a surplus. If it does not save them, it will not have a surplus. So I think this is a pretty clear case. Another case is Morocco. In the late 70s, Morocco undertook some large external borrowing in foreign currencies, very large as a share of GDP. That's the dotted line. And I also showed official flows which factor in exchange intervention. But as you can see, exchange intervention was tiny. It was foreign currency borrowing. That pulled the current account balance down. That's a solid line, not as much as the borrowing, but quite a bit. And then as the borrowing diminished, so did the current account. So again, a pretty clear case. Probably an interesting case is Korea. Korea, coming out of the Asian crisis, had a current account surplus. Again, the solid line. They were intervening. That's the dashed line. But those were coming down to something sort of sustainable and moderate in 2001, 2002. Then in 2003 and 2004, as the global economy picked up from recession, demand for Korea's exports boomed. This put upward pressure on the Korean exchange rate. Korean exchange rate is the dotted line. The government didn't want to allow this appreciation, wanted to damp it down, liked the export boom. So intervention soared, that's the dashed line, as they tried to fight the appreciation of their currency. And therefore, their current account went way up with the export boom. So that's a case of endogenous intervention where the current account was driving intervention as they were trying to stabilize the exchange rate. This is the kind of thing that's taken out of the main regressions because we don't want that reverse causality. But the interesting thing is that in Korea, something happened in 2005. What happened was there was a political outcry over losses, financial losses on the intervention. The yuan did appreciate a little bit despite the intervention, and this showed up as a loss on the dollars they had already bought. And there was some hearings in the Korean parliament at which politicians got an earful about why were they making these money-losing dollar purchases. And so in response to the political pressure, the government of Korea backed off. And as you can see, the dashed line falls sharply starting in 1995 with this political pressure. Now, without so much intervention, the yuan starts appreciating further. As you can see, the dotted line ticks up further. And lo and behold, the current account comes way down. So this sort of demonstrates both the sort of endogenous and the exogenous role of intervention in all this. Clearly, Korea's current account was driven by its intervention policies. Now, so pulling this all together across many countries, what we have here is for 2013, I've looked at the countries with the largest surpluses, current account surpluses. There's 8 countries there. And they had 736 billion of total current account surpluses. The little model that I estimated says that they should have 660 billion. There's other factors like demographics and fiscal policy, but the intervention is the next 2 columns, the official flows and the lag stock, 488 billion. That's about 2/3 of the surpluses of these countries can be traced right back to these policies. So finally, let me just conclude with the policy roles. It seems to me that a minimum standard for rules, countries are going to be tempted to use, now that we know intervention works and it can actually get you a lot of exports in a current account surplus, countries will be tempted to use it to grab demand in a global slowdown. As Larry said today, in a world of secular stagnation, countries will be looking for sources of growth. That leads to a huge temptation to abuse this policy because it steals growth from other countries. So a minimum standard, which I think would be consistent with IMF articles, would be that if you have excess reserves and you have a current account surplus, you should not be allowed to continue to buy reserves. You could make an exception for non-renewable resource exporters who want to save some of that for future generations, but within limits. And you could have a symmetric rule for deficit countries. It seems to me this is a minimum rule. It's what I read Article 4 is saying, and it would be sort of a do no harm. So finally, possibly we could consider a stronger standard. Beyond that, maybe we could encourage countries to do stabilizing foreign exchange interventions so that if their current account seemed to be above a norm that was acceptable, maybe they could push their exchange rate up, and if it was below a certain norm, they could push it down. They could intervene in that direction. I would not want any commitment on a particular value of the exchange rate because we don't know really much about where they should be, but it should be focused on the current accounts being out of whack. Certainly wouldn't want monetary policy to be used to the detriment of price stability and employment stability. But the goal here would be do some good at the margin, and I think the key point here where I think many professional economists would disagree would be seeing sterilized intervention as a powerful additional tool. I think the evidence is becoming more and more clear it is a powerful additional tool beyond monetary policy. This is not conventional wisdom. But something like this kind of rule seems to me is what Plaza was all about, and so maybe it's something that we should think about going forward.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to think about this very interesting book that we're reflecting on and where we're reflecting on the historical lessons. I was struck by many of the contributions in the book, and I think in particular it was also commented on this morning, the speech by James Baker, by the Treasury Secretary at the time of the Plaza Agreement, was really remarkable and very, very interesting and worth going over in some attention. One of the lines that struck me in that was that he was thinking of the logic of where the Plaza was pointing, and in a sense it's also the logic behind the suggestions that Fred Baxton was making in the book and this afternoon, basically goes in the direction of saying that there should be absolute stability, a global currency. There's one sentence from James Baker where he says that, but then admits there's no practical way to establish what may be the most effective solution, a global currency. I think it's worth pointing that out because one of the lessons and one of the aftermaths of the Plaza that didn't really get commented on a great deal in the book or in the discussion this morning was that it did have a sort of afterlife after 1987, after the intense phase of collaboration, cooperation, coordination in the Plaza to Louvre exercise ended. In the European setting, we're obviously thinking, in part because many of the speakers have been American, about the American role in the leadership in pushing the Plaza. But the last stage of the agreement, of this intense process, the Louvre Accord in February 1987, was also in many ways the result of the activity of the French finance minister, Edouard Balladur. And Balladur continued to think about the lessons of this and then really pushed those over the next couple of years in 87 and 88 in a series of papers that provided the basis for exactly what Secretary Baker referred to, a a single money, but in the European setting rather than in the world setting. And in a sense then, through Balladur, the Plaza to Louvre exercise had an enormous afterlife, a very, very important afterlife, in the move of Europe to a single currency. If you're looking at the European experience and then thinking about lessons from that, you think very quickly that the problem with this is that it's very, very hard to have a monetary unification without a fiscal unification. And that's obviously also the story that's going to stand in the way of schemes like those advocated sometimes by Richard Cooper or Bob Mundell, and taking up some earlier schemes, historical schemes, interesting schemes for a global world money. So in some ways our experience of the intense phase of cooperation really tells us that it doesn't work on the global level. It might work in a regional setting, but even working in a regional setting produces major strains. But obviously, at the same time, as everybody has been stressing today, the Plaza was addressing a real problem, and we heard about that problem. It's the problem of the current account imbalances, and it's the problem of the currency misalignments, and it's the problem of the rise of protectionism. And I fully agree with Fred Bergston on these issues, that they're around today. And in particular, the trade protection issue, I think, is really, really very worrying. It's not just a matter of Donald Trump. It's also key to the campaign of Bernie Sanders. It's also reflected in Hillary Clinton's reaction to the Sanders campaign. And if you think of her, I think rightly, as one of the architects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's really frightening to see the way in which she's retreated from that agreement, or that potential agreement, in the course of the political campaign. So there's clearly this mood around, but it's very, very hard to think that it could be dealt with by a currency agreement. And I think that's the consensus of the meeting. And in a sense, in the same way as Secretary Baker provided a kind of reductio ad absurdum about the Plaza by saying that the ultimate logic of the Plaza would lead to a global money, I think Fred Bergston this afternoon has really produced a reductio ad absurdum of applying the Plaza today when he laid out that chart about the exchange rate movements. Because if you think of the euro appreciating by 40% against the dollar, what that would do, I think, almost immediately is to blow up the euro altogether and blow up the European Union. So it's actually very, very difficult to envisage that kind of agreement taking place, which is why I think the panel so far has been reaching a consensus on this. But I think we might also think of the ways in which the world has changed since the 1980s. And in particular, I wonder really whether we would be as right to focus on current accounts as people were in the 1980s. We also heard that this morning from David Smith, that he says that foreign exchange dealers don't think about the current account. And in general, it's also clear that those big current account imbalances that we just heard about have really diminished since the global financial crisis. Really what's driving the world today is much more big movements on the capital account, and they're largely independent of the current account movements. And we should be addressing those movements if we're thinking of a way of dealing with the challenges of the global economy. So central banks are really doing something rather different now than they were dealing with in the 1980s. And the discussion, I think a very interesting discussion about the effectiveness of foreign exchange intervention and whether it's sterilized intervention or unsterilized intervention, that's a really big theme of the 1980s, this famous paper by Dominguez and Frenkel, and it's reflected nicely in the book by Frenkel. There's still a debate about foreign exchange intervention. We just heard that from Joseph Gagnon. But it's only a relatively small number of countries that do the foreign exchange intervention. And in the big area between the euro and the United States and Japan, it doesn't really play a role at all. But there is something else that plays a very important role. And so I thought it might be interesting to put that on the table for the discussion, because there's a sense in which the experiment in unconventional monetary policy is actually replicating some of the odd effects of the intervention policies in the 1980s. And I think it doesn't sound so plausible to think about that in this country. But once you start doing this in Europe, it becomes immediately apparent that QE is, in effect, a kind of exchange intervention. Because the QE, at least as the ECB has been doing it, involves buying securities, very, very often from foreign holders of those securities. And so you can think about what the effects of that would be. If the foreign holders of the securities are just selling the securities to the ECB, then you'll have an effect on the exchange rate. And it may well be that that's the most effective thing that QE has done in terms of providing stimulus to the European economy. It could also be that if you're thinking of it from the portfolio management point of view of the people who are selling the securities, then they might want to rebalance by buying other assets in Europe. They might want to buy real assets, make investments in the European economy, and if so, that would also be a great stimulus. And there's obviously also been a lot of discussion, in particular in regard to Chinese investment in the EU. But QE, in other words, has a kind of effect on the exchange rate and on the position. Now, if we think of what the analogy of the Plaza today would be, I think it would probably have to contain some element of a discussion of QE and the coordination of QE effects. So when I was trying to imagine as an answer to the question that we were asked to deal with, what a plaza, modern plaza, would look like, my idea is that it involves something like this, a discussion of avoiding bad spillover effects from QE and bad depreciation effects that prompt then the protectionist pressure and prompt the idea that the world is moving back to the world of the 1930s. Fundamentally, we're always here in a discussion of the 1930s. Larry Summers brought that up as well this morning, that the lesson from the 1930s was that you shouldn't have been so worried about the effects of exchange rate depreciation as long as you were getting the stimulus. And the trade war discussion was really a kind of sideshow and was blinding people to what should have been done in terms of monetary policy. But clearly there was the trade war aspect of the 1930s, and I think you need then to think of the implications of that for today. when you're designing coordinated monetary policy between the major currency areas. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, and congratulations for this excellent book, which brings back the topic of international monetary cooperation on the agenda of the discussions that are going to take place here in Washington these days. I think this is a very relevant issue. So I think I will take advantage of the fact of being the last speaker, and so every topic has already been covered, to perhaps make a couple of comments about the sort of the historical background of the Plaza Accord as seen from Europe, because I mean, a lot of the papers, perhaps because of the nationality of their authors, are concentrated on the U.S.-Japan relationship, which of course was crucial. But I must say that there was a strong interest in Europe as well, and certainly in Germany, France, and also the United Kingdom, but also in other countries like Italy that were not formally represented in the G5, although, you know, Italy and Canada had been participating in the G7 since the summit of the G7 in Puerto Rico, and actually Italy was already at the first G6 in Rambouillet. So I think this is a peculiar aspect of international monetary cooperation, in which a smaller number of countries wanted to play a key role. But at least as far as the central banks of the countries that were not fully represented in the G5, I think we did play a rather active role. And I think it is not just a sort of a purely factual remark, but I think there has been a lot of sort of, I would say, elaboration about the fact that when the Plaza Agreement took place in September, the dollar had already started to decline, as if this was the sort of the result of some sort of automatic or autonomous correction by the markets. Now that's not true, because I think there was certainly an important statement in January '85 by the G5, which indicated that they were ready to conduct a coordinated foreign exchange market intervention in compliance with the agreements reached by the G7 summit in the previous year. And but in February, precisely on the 26th of February, there was a first episode of coordinated intervention conducted by the European central banks, conducted sort of under the guidance of the Bundesbank, to which the Banque de France, the Bank of Italy, and also the Bank of Japan, as soon as the day came to their shore. I think that was probably the turning point in the trend of the dollar. And I think the reason why countries in Europe participated was that because of the bubble that had been so eloquently described by Fred, I think there was intense fear that this would restoke inflation in Europe, and also particularly for oil importing countries like certainly France and Italy. You know, there was the problem of the increase in the oil bill that would become all the more difficult to bear, you know, if this trend in the appreciation of the dollar would continue. So I think this is an important factual consideration. I must say that there was in the summer of '85 there was an element of confusion because the G10 was at that time still alive. The group of 10 produced a report on the reform of the international monetary system that had been prepared by my former boss, Lamberto Dini, who was the chairman of the deputies of the G10, and in which basically came out very much strongly against coordinated intervention and instead reiterated the fact that perhaps the only solution to discuss, the international spillovers or repercussions that they were called at that time was through IMF surveillance. So I think that created some confusion, and in fact the dollar started to appreciate again a little bit during the summer months because it wasn't clear whether the action undertaken by the European Central Bank and Japan in February would be followed up later on. So I think the Plaza Agreement really made a very important contribution, and I think I don't have to repeat, what has been already said. Obviously, the objective was supposed to stop the dollar appreciation, and I think the objective was achieved. Then, the Louvre was supposed to stop the dollar depreciation, and that objective too was achieved. So I think on the whole, under the very special circumstances at the time, I think the objectives were certainly met. I think another omission, perhaps in some of the historical recollections of this, not only of this period but subsequent period, was the important coordinated intervention conducted by the G7 in support of the euro in the year 2000. This was, again, a situation in which I think Larry Summers also played an important role because I think he basically agreed that the decline of the euro, which had gone completely out of hand at that time, would have systemic implications also for financial stability, affecting also the United States, which I think was a courageous decision to take at the time. So I think that probably this kind of episodes. And I recall that Michael Musso was still at that time the chief economist of the IMF, wrote a piece in which he said, well, maybe foreign exchange market intervention doesn't work, but if you don't intervene in a situation like this one, then when are you going to intervene? So I think that was an important recognition. But now, going back to the question of the panel, whether there are the conditions for a new Plaza. I think the book is rich of hints about the need for a new approach to international monetary cooperation, and I think this is the key contribution that comes from the papers by Fred, by John Taylor, by Agnès Benassi-Carrier, and also by Joe Gagnon. And but there are also other contributions. I think the very role played by Secretary Baker and also by Paul Volcker. They all hint at the need to reconsider the scope for international monetary cooperation. Now, I agree that there is not much scope for a sort of a Plaza type of agreement, but I'm very much worried about what I have called in a number of written occasions, the fault lines in the international monetary system. Now, what are the fault lines is that, we have a completely different type of approach by the G7 on one side and the major emerging markets on the other side on some of the fundamental positions about the working of the international monetary system. Now, the G7, particularly in that rather blunt statement that was issued in February of 2013, while I was still not a Minister of Finance, because I think I would have objected to that kind of strong language which said I think the monetary policy should be purely oriented to domestic purposes, and we should not target exchange rates and forget about the possible implication of spillover. So I think this is the G7 approach is free floating, free capital markets, no intervention, perhaps more transparency about monetary policy, and perhaps some sort of promise of liquidity assistance through perhaps the swap network. And except on the other hand, the emerging markets, they consider, completely different approach, in which they consider essential foreign exchange market intervention, capital controls, and a huge accumulation of reserves. So how do you reconcile this kind of differential approach? Unfortunately, through capital controls, and leading possibly to the risk of financial fragmentation and also to trade protectionism. And we have seen already the proliferation of bilateral regional agreements and so forth. So I think what new approach to international monetary policy monetary cooperation should be to look at the impact of financial globalization and avoid the periods of boom and bust which are created by the financial cycle and the risk of currency wars. I think in order to do that, I think the major countries should use all available instruments. Of course, first of all, monetary policy, fiscal policy, reforms, but there should be no preclusion about using a foreign exchange intervention if this is required. Now, in conclusion, obviously, the Plaza and Louvre were unique, and I don't think there is sort of the conditions for a resumption of that type of action, although the figures that Fred produced are indeed quite impressive. But I tend to agree with what Jim Bolton said, that the capital movements have hijacked the exchange rates, and I think we now need to look again at this kind of broad implications of the financial cycles, looking at the work that has been done by the BIS and by other economists, and also take into account that, as I implied, if you want to pursue this kind of policies, then the result is to go back on the road of financial integration, which I don't think is going, and trade integration, which I don't think is going to be very helpful to the world economy. So, to sum up, I think it is certainly the lesson from the Plaza Louvre is that probably under present circumstances is wrong to focus our attention on the foreign exchange, on the exchange rate alone, but I think it would be wrong also to ignore the foreign exchange movements entirely. And I think we have to perhaps work on this kind of issues, taking into account that, for example, as it has been said just a moment ago by Harold James, the quantitative easing policies that have been adopted by the European Union are indeed an attempt to ensure that a decoupling of interest rate movements between the United States and Europe will continue as long as needed to overcome the recession and the risk of deflation in Europe. This is a novelty. Interest rates used to move in unison, and the attempt to achieve a decoupling, of course, will have an impact on the exchange rate, but that I think in this kind of global financial system we are living in is probably inevitable. So I think in terms of what Domenico Lombardi called the technology of the cooperation, probably this cooperation should remain within the G20, and perhaps, as Fred indicated, some steps are going forward in that direction. But as far as monetary policy and exchange rate policies are concerned, the role should be sort of allocated to a smaller group of central banks, including the major players, of course, will be in a sort of a new G7 or G5 or G6, whatever the chosen numbers. But I think the G20, unfortunately, is, in my view, a little too big to conduct a concrete form of cooperation in these delicate areas. Thank you.
We can open up, and we have time for a few questions. Let's group the questions, and then we go back to the panelists in reverse order. I have Mark Sobel, my colleague Jim Bolton, and then Bill Klein.
I just had a set of interrelated questions, and I apologize for missing this morning's presentation, so I hope I'm not overlapping. But the first of the interrelated questions is, do countries agree on what should be coordinated? And especially for floaters, should countries coordinate underlying policies, or should they coordinate exchange rates and then back out the policies consistent with that? And then if we do agree on what to coordinate, what objectives are being trying to achieve? I mean, are we trying to achieve growth rates? Are we trying to achieve current account patterns? Are we trying to achieve a pattern of fiscal sustainability? And do countries agree on that? And then, if they do agree, do countries agree on the economic model that gets them towards those objectives? That was it.
Thank you, Mark. Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to just return for a moment to the point that Fred made earlier when he said that, in his view, what leadership means in this context is the need for U.S. leadership. And I think that was certainly right in 1985. And you could not have had the Plaza meeting without strong leadership from the U.S. He's probably still right in 2016 that this Shanghai G20 communique couldn't really mean anything unless it was fully embraced by and led by the U.S. Following responsible policies. But will it still be right in 2020 that assume that China becomes the world's largest economy by then? I don't think anybody would say, well, what we need is Chinese leadership. But they're not going to be saying anymore that it can't work without U.S. leadership. What they're going to be saying, it seems to me, is that it needs to be more of a peer process, that countries need to show more mutual respect and cooperation if, in fact, cooperation is going to succeed. So it seems to me that makes it harder, but if anybody could comment on how they think that might work, I think that would really be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. We have one more question from the mic over there.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. I just wanted to ask you, Fred, in the context of your Plaza Light observation, it seems to me that your subsequent sentence about potential G2 is perhaps more relevant. Certainly Japan at a G20 meeting in Shanghai wouldn't have agreed to something that saw the yen go up when all these, as we heard from Larry Summers, would have suggested it would have gone down.
Thank you. Last question from... Okay.
That's when I do this, Domenico.
Okay, so I'm sorry I have to cut you out. Apologies.
Yeah, the answers, of course.
Okay, so let's go back in reverse order. Maybe try to be very succinct if you can, starting with Fabrizio.
Yes, I think, say a word about the question by Mark Sobel. I think in the present circumstances we should target growth. But And I think because particularly in Europe, if the prospect of stagnation and deflation continue, that of course will have a very negative impact also on the cohesion. But I think that applies also to the global scene. You know, we have a deterioration of the growth prospects in the emerging countries, in China, in Brazil, in India, perhaps is an exception, but in the other as well. So I think that should be the key objective, but we shouldn't do it the way it was done by the G20 in Australia, in which it was promised that we will all increase our growth rates by 2% without saying how and by how much. In a way, one should perhaps look back again at the locomotive approach that was so much criticized in the 70s. But we should look at the previous examples of policy coordination to learn from our mistakes and improve, rather than completely sort of forget about it and rely entirely on the operation of market forces.
Harold?
So yes, I agree on the coordination issue. I think the general framework of thinking about greater growth is right, and also more concretely of thinking of it in terms of greater leeway for fiscal action at the moment. I mean, I think that's really the question that's out there. The second question on leadership, Jim Bouton's question, I wonder really, I mean, in some ways, by many measures, China is already the world's largest economy. But the question that we're thinking about here of these financial sector destabilization issues, that's not really so much a issue of what China is doing, but it's an issue of dollar funding and in part of euro funding. So those issues are really important. And in a sense, when you're thinking about who is the global lender of last resort, it's the Federal Reserve System. It was very, very clear in the discussion of the swaps this morning. And that's because banks rely on dollars for funding, but it's also a euro issue now.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Well, it would take a long time to answer Mark Sopel's question and also Barry's, and I'll just make one quick point, which also actually happens to address something that Harold and Fabrizio said in their comments, which is, I think when countries meet to discuss policy, I think all policies are fair game for discussion. Absolutely, it's fine. But if you look, for example, at the IMF articles, there's a clear distinction between internal policies and external policies. Internal policies, the premier ones are monetary and fiscal. External is foreign exchange intervention and currency policy. Countries in the IMF only have restrictions on external policies, not internal. I think that's important. My research says that's a good distinction to make, because it matters a lot when you go out and buy assets, whether you're buying domestic assets or foreign assets. The spillovers are much greater in the second case, and the domestic benefits are much smaller. So there's much more presumption that the world has a right to put restrictions on external policies than internal policies. But that's just a tiny step towards answering your question, Mark.
Thank you. Fred, so you can conclude.
To Mark, I would say all of the above, but you forgot one as a goal, and that's maintaining an open trading system. And that's what we were focused today, really was the underlying driver behind the Plaza, and could again become the underlying driver if the protectionist pressures that Harold and I talked about really did start to get out of hand. On both Jim and Barry, I don't think it makes any difference whether the U.S. or China is the biggest economy in the world. We're within a few trillion dollars of each other. We're going to be within a few trillion dollars of each other for a while. China's going to keep increasing its lead, but you're not going to get any progress on the macro issues, opposed to financial, the growth issues in particular, but probably the trade issues, unless the U.S. and China agree. And that's the case for a G2, not in a sense of replacing the G5 or 7 or even the G20, or certainly not the IMF, but being the steering committee within the steering committee, without whose prior concurrence you're probably not going to make much progress.
Thank you, Fred. And on this note, I'm going to turn over to Adam.
Well, thank you all. I'm sorry to cut things off, but we have had a very full day, and our speakers and our audience have been very generous so far. I would just like to thank again Fabrizio and Harold, especially for joining us, and Domenico for partnering with us with CG and chairing the panel. Thanks as well again to Russell and to Fred for producing the fine volume which is available. And a final shout out to, which I didn't do earlier, to Joseph Gagnon, whose research agenda in this area, including his paper for this volume, has been key and who played a great role in helping us put together this conference as well. So thank you very much, Joe. This meeting is adjourned.